Hey folks, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be talking about optimizing flow in a mixed reef tank. And not just any mixed reef tank, but how you optimize flow in a mixed reef with sand. In particular, I have pretty fine grained sand. So we're going to get into that. Now a disclaimer, and this is with any video from me, I know there's several different ways to have a successful reef tank. So take that for what it's worth. Take my advice for what it's worth. I'm trying to just share principles or techniques or strategies that are helpful. I'm not here to say that this is exactly where you got to put your pumps to get the best flow and this is what is needed to be successful. I'm here just to provide you a few tips that I think will be helpful for you as you strive to get good flow to your SPS corals, but not pound those LPS corals too much so their flesh starts to tear, and not having sandstorms. So let's get into it. So let's first talk about the flow that comes from your return pump. Now I typically don't count this as flow. I run a pretty moderate or slow amount of flow through my sump. I like a lot of contact time with my skimmer and with my refugium, so I don't have a lot of flow going through my sump, and so the return pump isn't really giving a ton of flow. But the strategy I typically use is, as you can see here, I use the return pump flow for two things. One, surface agitation. That helps with pH, right? Given that your CO2 levels are low. So I always use my return pump flow for surface agitation. It's pretty gentle and it doesn't go crazy, right? It's not splashing and it's consistent. Now the other thing is I tend to point my return pump flow towards the back of the tank. So as my tank is set up now, I don't have anything but two pumps, just two MP40s, and that's working okay for the moment, and we'll talk about that. But for my return lines, I just point them back towards the back of the tank in hopes of getting flow behind the rockwork, since I don't have a pump back there yet. And it does a pretty good job of circulating flow behind the rockwork, having both of those return lines pointed towards the very sides of the tank. That kind of has a gyre effect, or gyre effect, however you pronounce that. It has a rotational effect of flow that gets behind the rockwork, and that makes sure that there's no detritus that starts gathering up in the sand back there. So that strategy has always worked really well. And it also works well because if you point those lock line nozzles towards the front of the glass or other areas, I find that it just complicates my other goals of my flow, specifically with my two MP40s here. Now let's talk about the main flow of my tank. I have two MP40s and they're on each side of the tank. Now previously I had a couple directional pumps on the back wall, but my MP40s, I put on these new guards. These are guards. This is the wide flow guard. I picked them off Bulk Reef Supply. If you're interested in them, let me know. I can send you the name. But these guards really widen the flow pattern of these pumps. So when I added them to the tank, I had enough flow suddenly where I could remove those back pumps for now. Now as corals grow in, you're going to probably need to add pumps. But right now, with the wide flow pattern I have going on here, these two MP40s are working quite well. Now here's the advantage of these guards. People buy them to protect their anemones and fish, stuff like that. I like them because not only do they give you wide flow, but I can put them pretty high up, and you don't get that tornado effect or the suction effect that commonly occurs with the normal guards on the MP40s. So I can put them pretty close to the surface, pretty high up, and run them pretty high without that tornado effect. And I find that you generally want to run these pumps pretty high, so if you put your LPS corals towards the bottom of the tank, they're not getting blasted if you run these pumps pretty high up. So that's been a great advantage to having these guards. Now another advantage of these guards is not a lot of light penetrates to the impeller area, so you don't get a lot of algae buildup there. And because the pump, this kind of cover, has has a ton of little holes, I actually will I'll grab a turbo snail, Mexican turbo snail, I'll throw one on there, and they'll go to work on the pump and get it cleaned in a day or two. So I think having these guards is really going to reduce my maintenance time on my MP40s as well. So that's another reason why I love these. Now let's talk about how I have them positioned. You'll notice I have one on each side of this tank. It's about a 4-foot tank. Now, and I have a 2-island rockscape. Okay, so I want flow on each island and not necessarily a ton of flow in the middle, because if I get a lot of flow in the middle, that starts to part my sand, and sand starts going everywhere. So how you get around that is if you have two pumps pointing at each other, offset them a little bit. So you can see I have one pump on the on the right of the tank. It's kind of towards the center of the tank, and then this pump on the left side is a little bit more to the front. And so when the flow of these two pumps collide, the collision does happen, right? So it does provide a chaotic flow. But if since they're a little bit off center from each other, the collision isn't so strong that it creates this parting wave in the middle where the sand starts to go crazy. So that's a technique that I've always used, is offset your two pumps if you point them at each other on each side of the tank. If you're using like MP40s or Tunsy pumps, something like that. Okay? That always works really well. So keep that in mind when you set up your flow. So let's look at a couple of corals here. On the side here I got a gold hammer and then just your typical frog spawn. And they're moving pretty good at moments, right? So I have moments where the corals are moving quite vigorously. The polyps are swaying quite vigorously, so there's a lot of flow, it appears like, or a moderate amount of flow. And then I have moments of like a lull moment, or a moment of hardly any flow. And what I found, and this is just me, what I found is that when I run a mixed tank where I have SPS corals and I want that strong chaotic flow, but then my LPS corals can't handle that flow, what I've found is if you have a moment of quietness where there's hardly any flow, and give that LPS coral a rest period, that then they are able to withstand the moments of higher flow. So yes, like SPS, we want chaotic, strong flow all the time, but this is a mixed reef, and so I have to make some sacrifices. I could give the corals less flow, but continuous and chaotic, but I find my corals are a little happier when I can give them a ton of flow, a moments of chaos, and then I can keep my LPS corals if I give them a little quiet time too. So now I'm going to show you, here's my Ora green bird's nest coral. I love this coral. And I'll just kind of demonstrate. Let's watch this coral for a minute. So here we have some moments where the polyps aren't moving a lot, right? And this is giving me a lull moment. So the LPS corals are hardly moving. But I know this coral wants strong chaotic flow to grow and to grow well. And so just watch this, how sometimes, the way in which you set up your pumps, you can achieve this. And watch how these polyps start to go, start to move quite vigorously and with a lot of chaoticness, and they're happy, right? And then, but right next to that coral, I have some LPS corals, and they are happy too, and they are swaying quite vigorously. But then they have those moments of those quiet moments that allows those polyps to kind of regroup, if you will. And then that is the technique that I've found has given me the most success. So in short, you're giving the SPS corals strong chaotic flow. You can't do it all the time, so you give them periods of strong chaotic flow, and then there's moments of quietness in terms of the flow. And then those LPS corals, when they get hammered a little bit there for a moment, then they can recover and kind of recoup. Again, you can, if you're familiar with MP40s, the safe bet is reef crest mode, right? But this alternating approach really helps me have that strong chaotic flow for a moment of quietness, and then corals, both types of corals kind of get what they need in doses. So that's kind of how I work things. Now another principle that I believe to be true, acclimation. Just like with your lighting, I believe you can acclimate corals to more flow. So what I'll do is, I'll get the flow pattern set up like I've talked about. I'll run that flow pattern for a few days. See if the corals are happy. See if the LPS corals are extended. See if my stony corals have the white growth tips. And then I'll think, okay, Things are generally happy, things are surviving, maybe not thriving yet, so let's push the envelope a little bit. So what I'll do is every few days I will up the flow by 5%. I will up the intensity and I'll watch. So I'll up the flow by 5% and then watch. See how the LPS corals do over the next day or two. If they're still open and extended, then I'm feeling pretty good about things. And so I will up the flow again another 5%. And so I'll keep doing that until the polyps start to suck in, right? Until the coral starts to look less happy, then I'll back off by 5%. And then I'll run that flow pattern with that intensity for maybe a week or 2 weeks, 3 weeks, maybe a month even. And then I'll revisit it. I'll say, you know what? Let's see if we can turn this up again. Let's see if the coral, the LPS coral, is become used to this new flow pattern. And in many cases, I've been able to continually increase the flow, where my SPS corals are actually looking pretty happy. Polyps are really dancing. And then those LPS corals are still extending and happy. So that seems to work pretty well for me, that kind of incremental approach to increasing intensity of flow throughout time. Now I want to reiterate the other benefit, again, of the alternating pump, pump intensity is alternating and not both going at the same time, is it also takes care of the flying sand bed. So yes, ideally I would like both pumps running at a fair amount of intensity at the same time, and I want that collision to happen, but I have to control that collision, and the alternating of ramp up of intensity helps control that collision, of the flow, tames it back a little bit and prevents the sandstorms. So that's another benefit of why I'm running this kind of alternating gyre type system. Is it does help keep the sand pretty close, prevents the sand from moving. As you can see, I have a pretty thin layer of sand and it's staying put for the most part. Now there are moments where it was flying around like crazy. A new tank, you'll have that, right? In a new tank, you're going to have sand going everywhere because that layer of bacteria that needs time to develop on that sand, that helps kind of, in my opinion, make it more sticky and a little heavier. And so brand new tank, brand new sand, it's going to fly everywhere for a while. But after 6 months or so, that sand should get a little stickier and weigh itself down a little better. So guys, that's the few principles that I follow, the few techniques and strategies that work for me in setting up flow for a mixed reef system. So yes, you have to compromise, I think. If you want sand, if you want LPS corals, if you want SPS corals, you got to compromise, but there is a way. This is the way that I've found success where everything is generally pretty happy. Thanks again, guys. Appreciate it. Give me a like, give me a thumbs up. That really does help me in the algorithm. Appreciate all your support. We'll see you in the next one. Peace.